Kia ora koutou, ko Rosalie Jenkins toku ingoa. Here tua o ki Generation Zero. So welcome everyone, my name's Rosalie and I'm a volunteer with Generation Zero. I'd just like to say thank you for coming out tonight to hear about our Zero Carbonate campaign. I'm super excited about it and I hope that you will all leave here tonight feeling just as excited. We've got a pretty great lineup tonight, so I'll just quickly give you an idea of the schedule and then we'll crack into it. So first of all, we're going to hear from Pham, who's a councillor at ECAN, and she's going to sort of set the scene for us with an introductory address. We've then got Chris from our team, who's going to give the Zero Carbonate presentation, and then we'll have a bit of a break to give you guys a chance to grab a drink and some nibbles, and we'll come back together after that for a panel discussion where we've got Professor Ratuva from the university, Adelia Hallett from Forest and Bird, and Pubudu Senanayake from Generation Zero. So that's your chance to sort of ask us any questions, find out more about the campaign, but also hear from the people up the front as to why climate change is a big issue for them. So that should be great. And yeah, I'll keep you updated along the way. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker for the evening, Pham. Like I said, Lan is a councillor at ECAN. She was actually the highest polling elected councillor, and she's been a bit of a superstar ever since she's been elected in terms of fighting for water and climate within local government. So thank you, Lan, for all the great work that you're doing, and it's a pleasure to have you here tonight. We realise that you're a very busy lady, so thank you for making time for this, and we look forward to what you have to say. Over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Rosalie. I'll just make sure this is good. Okay, can everyone hear me? Down the back? Yeah, awesome. Well, yeah, thank you, Rosalie, and thank you, Generation Zero, for inviting me to kick off this really important conversation that we'll have tonight. So, kia ora tātou, my name is Pham, and like Rosalie mentioned, I'm one of your elected councillors for Environment Canterbury, which is your regional council here. And just to be really clear from the outset, I'm not here tonight speaking on behalf of ECAN. I'm speaking from my own personal opinion as your councillor, because I have got into a spot of trouble with that in the past. So before running for ECAN last year, I was actually out stationed on the beautiful remote Rao Island in the Comodex, which is our northernmost island. And I was out there as part of my work. I was running the science contract for Scripps Institute in California, which runs a global carbon monitoring program. But even from this island paradise, seemingly isolated from all human influence, it was really depressing to see our data set climb beyond 400 parts per million. No place on Earth, no human, no species or ecosystem is untouched from the impacts of climate change. My background was first in freshwater ecology, and it was our quirky, unique, but increasingly rare native freshwater fish which first got me interested and engaged in environmental issues. But as the years, or increasingly decades, have passed, and the reality of catastrophic climate change impacts have dawned on me, I've come to see biodiversity, despite it being so critical to planet sustainability, as almost a luxury. What really keeps me up at night are the bare basics in human survival. You know, are we going to have safe, reliable drinking water in 10 or 20 years' time? Are we going to be able to have options for growing food or pasture when we can no longer rely on synthetic fertilisers produced by fossil fuels? In fact, the more I have learnt, the clearer it becomes that both our challenges and our solutions around both freshwater and climate are inextricably linked. I've just returned last night from the local government conference based in Auckland this year, where we had mayors, chairs, councillors and local community board members all being addressed by the various big names in the party leaders, Bill English, Andrew Little, James Shaw, even Winston came and had a good rant. And it's really got me pondering a few questions. In any global disaster, is there an obvious point in time when society most desperately needs leadership? Is it the day before doomsday? Minutes before? Or do we really need to wait for that disaster to be in full swing for us to actually take action? Now, of course, in an ideal world, I think, leaders would step up and lead as soon as we know that a crisis is looming. Now, I can understand that in the past, we've arguably had valid excuses for not being adequately prepared for the totally unexpected natural disasters which catch our planning off guard. But our present day knowledge through science and technological advances now allows us to look much further into the future. And we know that when it comes to climate disruption, we have the ability, albeit in this relatively small window of 3 to 5 years, to stave off the worst of its consequences for humanity. And I think what alarmed me most about this weekend is that when it comes to climate change action, the leadership sirens don't appear to be blaring. I can only guess that perhaps they're not even plugged in, and that lack of urgency is something I want to touch on tonight. The World Meteorological Society now describes our Earth as being in truly uncharted territory. So let's not beat around the bush. Climate change will completely disrupt our world as we know it. And we know that this isn't some hypothetical future prediction. It's already catching us both ill-prepared and vulnerable. The United Nations just recently have declared the East African famine, currently devastating millions of people across Kenya, Somalia and Ethiopia, as the worst humanitarian disaster in modern history. Closer to home, with our most recent flooding across Otago, here in Canterbury and here in Christchurch, we're experiencing 1 in 50 years or 1 in 100-year flooding events with increasing regularity. And with the threat of increasing natural disasters and climate disruptions, the urgency for action is growing by the day. The latest call to action is Mission 2020, a set of 6 milestones set out by a panel of experts, convened by Christiana Figueres, who is the former Executive Secretary of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Mission 2020 aims to urge countries to adopt and implement 6 milestones which cover energy, industry, land use, transport, finance and infrastructure in order to meet global targets to avoid the worst effects of climate change. The report pinpoints the year 2020 as the deadline by which we must hit peak carbon emissions, or it warns, face nothing short of a calamity. Our window for saving our climate has effectively been narrowed to less than 3 years. So if the message is not yet clear, it's that governments need to act fast. Our globe's best shot at progress to date has been the Paris Climate Agreement, which the New Zealand government signed in 2015. Unfortunately, leadership and urgency have been lacking, and at the international level, it's been pointed out as such, as our government's commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 30% from 2005 levels by 2030 is woefully insufficient to actually meet our Paris commitment. Our lack of tangible action means that New Zealand's greenhouse gases continue to rise, and per capita, we're amongst the highest 5 in the OECD. Our emissions trading scheme is ineffective, based on phony Ukrainian carbon credits, and it excludes agriculture, which is our biggest emitter at 49% of emissions. In addition, despite opposition from councils and iwi across New Zealand, our government continues to offer up swathes of our ocean and our land for oil and gas exploration, despite the fact that we know that we cannot even afford to burn even our known reserves of fossil fuels. Our government's freshly announced budget of $4 million for climate change over 4 years to progress our nation's climate policy is an embarrassing pittance, highlighting the fact that leadership by central government continues to be, at best, misguided and sluggish, and at worst, willfully negligent. At a regional council level, the news doesn't get much better, as our ability to put in policy measures which actually prevent the worst climate change impacts are limited. Currently, the resource management limits local government to adaptation. So, in other words, by all means, we can plan for the seas to rise and the pests to get out of control, but we can't necessarily put in measures that prevent our emissions from climbing in the first place. This is completely irresponsible, and climate mitigation needs to happen at all levels of government. Local government, I believe, needs a mandate from Parliament, regardless of who makes up that government, that not only allows us, but requires us to be part of the transition to a zero carbon world. The one shining light of leadership that's come out of Parliament has been the Vivid Economics Net Zero in New Zealand report, commissioned by Globe and NZ, which is a cross-party group of 35 MPs from across the political spectrum. It sets out different scenarios which will drive large-scale emission reductions, such as moving us towards 100% renewable energy, the substantial electrification of our vehicle fleet, and sweeping land use changes from pastoral agriculture to forestry, as well as a drastic drop in our dairy, sheep and beef herds of up to 30%. The report concludes that it is possible for New Zealand to move on a pathway consistent with net zero emissions in the second half of the century, but only if we alter our land use patterns. The takeaway message outlines that if we're serious about keeping global warming to 1.5 degrees, then the net zero 2050 option is our clearest pathway to ensure that our emissions reach net zero by 2050. So we have for the first time some architecture to guide policy debate and decision making at a central government level. But we know from past reports that a report can be just that, a report. It doesn't necessarily result in tangible action, policy or change. And this is where I think the Zero Carbon Act comes in as the most coherent policy and clear direction that we've got today. I know that Chris will touch on this afterwards, but just as a summary, the Act calls for legally binding emission targets using 5-year carbon budgets and implements an effective firewall which prevents us from just buying international credits and trading them that way. Importantly, the Act also establishes an independent climate commission, which is outside of government, that provides expert advice and ultimately holds the government to account. I believe the local government sector needs to pick up the Zero Carbon Act and run with it. I'd like to see us form a clear sector-wide view which calls for central government to mandate us to mitigate against the worst impending disaster in human history. We need to do this before September to ensure whatever government takes power has committed to effective climate policy and local government mitigation. And I'm hopeful from yesterday's election at LGNZ, where we elected a new president in the form of Dave Cull, who's the Dunedin Mayor currently, and a few other initiatives which we can touch on later, that I hope that we're moving towards this. For our leaders, be they local, national or international, climate change allows us to make decisions that will have benefits that cross our imagined economic, cultural, social and environmental divides. The spectrum of climate change, both the breadth of the issue itself and our response to it, blurs the lines between local, national and international decision making and the global consequences which can result. It allows us the opportunity to embrace a new way of thinking, to plan for a new world which thrives within planetary boundaries and acknowledges that true human progress must be in step with our environment. Waiting to see the bat signal at 2 minutes to midnight seems to be the current strategy of central and much of local government. But I prefer to think that urgent, proactive leadership isn't too much to ask, especially when we have been handed solid, well-researched policy on a plate in the form of the Zero Carbon Act. And I just want to finish with the observation that in the absence of leadership, people step forward as leaders to fill the vacuum. Thank you, Generation Zero, for clearly stepping up as our leaders, and thank you to everyone here who's come out and is willing to put your voice and your influence in your communities, family groups or group of mates towards backing the Act and very clearly sending the message to whoever it is that takes office this September that you demand climate action. We all need to play a part in this if we're literally going to save the world. As Obama said a few years ago, we are the first generation to feel the effect of climate change, but we are the last generation that will be able to do something about it. Thanks for your attention, and I'm looking forward to this evening and the conversation ahead. Cheers.
Can everyone hear me? It would be really annoying and remove this and stand up here. So thank you, Lan, for that great summary of where we are and where we need to get to and how urgent that transition is. And also for all of your leadership in ECAN and in local government. So I'm Chris, I'm with Generation Zero. I've been with the group for a few years now, and I'm going to be talking to you a bit more about the Zero Carbon Act, about what it is, what it does, and kind of how we're hoping to achieve that. So a couple of years ago at Paris, the international community agreed that we really do need to do something about climate change. We need to, at the minimum, keep warming below that threshold of 2 degrees to keep things safe. And countries, or all of the signatories to Paris, made contributions to reduce their CO2 emissions. And as Lan said, those contributions as they stand are insufficient. So what we need as New Zealand is we need to reduce our emissions to 0 by 2050. That is essentially where we need to go if we want to stay within our carbon budget, to stay at that 2 degrees warming threshold. And currently where we are, our current goals are insufficient. And looking at that goal, 0 by 2050, that's a long-term goal. It's not something that can just be left to individual governments. It's not something we can trust any one political party to deal with, which is why we need something like the Zero Carbon Act. We need a policy framework that binds not just the government of the day, but future governments to address the problem of climate change. And so, looking at where we are at the moment, not only are our current targets insufficient, but we're not even going to meet those. So on this graph here, the straight yellow line, if you can see it hopefully, the short straight line is the government's current targets that they've said they're going to meet. The dotted line going up is the government's own projections of what our carbon emissions are going to be doing. So even the government admits that currently we're not going to meet our current insufficient goals. And the purple line going down to 0 is where we need to be going. It's getting to 0 by 2050. And the longer we wait to start that transition, the steeper that line is going to be. So as Lan said, we really need to get onto this within the next 2 or 3 years. We really don't have a lot of time before we need to start making that transition. So this is really what Gen Zero has been building to for 5 years now, 6 years now, ever since we started in 2011. We've run a whole bunch of campaigns all around trying to get ordinary people and our politicians to stand up to deal with climate change and to really take action. And the Zero Carbon Act is where that's all been leading to. So we have a quick video that we're going to play here.
climate change is real. It is already causing devastating problems in our country and around the world.
We are heading for mass extinction.
Glaciers are responding to that warmer temperature and they're retreating.
Accountability buddy, here to keep you on track with your New Year's resolutions. I see you've been phoning your mum, you're obviously getting fit, but what about that third one?
No comment.
Wait! Come back!
Okay, I can talk now. Do you have the things we talked about?
Yes, I have the credits.
Great. I'll put the money through tonight then.
Excellent.
Yes! That's resolution 3 solved.
Hey, government.
Hey, did you see I got my resolutions done?
Yeah, well, it turns out carbon trading doesn't reduce your carbon pollution.
What?
But I've written something that will.
The Zero Carbon Act has 3 key elements. 1. Sets New Zealand on a pathway to zero carbon pollution by 2050 with bite-sized 5-yearly targets. 2. Requires the government of the day to have a plan to achieve this. And 3. An independent climate commission to advise the government and keep the public in the loop. We're holding the government to account on its resolution. Visit our website to learn more.
Okay, good. So that was a real brief introduction to the Zero Carbon Act, and here are again those key points that the Zero Carbon Act includes and what we want it to achieve. So obviously we want net zero emissions by 2050. Hopefully you're getting that point from me by now. So those targets are legally binding. So the government of the day is required to actually set targets and then to meet them, to have plans and to meet them, which will be regarded as an integral part of what the government needs to achieve, not an optional goal that they can just ignore, like what seems to be happening with the Paris Agreement currently. And in order to enforce that, we'll have an independent climate commission whose job it will be to assess those targets in light of how they are working towards allowing New Zealand to reach carbon zero by 2050 and also to stay within our carbon budget, so the total amount of carbon that we can emit without overshooting our proportion of the world's remaining carbon that will allow us to stay within 2 degrees of warming, or ideally 1.5 degrees of warming. And it requires the government to actually have a plan to achieve that, to avoid our current situation where the government has targets but doesn't really seem to be doing anything about it, which is not ideal. These points are modelled on the UK's Climate Change Act, which they passed back in 2008 and which seems to be working at the moment. So they've been making progress on reducing their emissions, and just recently, just today in fact, they've announced that they're going to in fact be banning the sale of all petrol or diesel cars by 2040. So we're actually seeing real action being made, or hopefully in the future, real action being made by their government as a result of this Climate Change Act. So New Zealand obviously is a bit different from the UK. So there's a few things that make New Zealand pretty unique in the world. The first is obviously the Treaty of Waitangi, which requires that Maori be involved, or requires that we involve Maori in the forming of our laws. And so we really think it's important that they're involved both in the drafting of the Zero Carbon Act and also in the setting of these interim goals and in deciding how they're going to be implemented. And we think it's essential that we engage with Maori in that process, and that's something we haven't been great at doing up till now at the moment, but we really want to do that moving forward. So if any of you have contacts that you think could help us with that, we'd really ask you to come talk to us, to kind of help us network with those people and help talk to people in communities, especially Maori, that we wouldn't normally, or we don't normally have good reach to with. And secondly, New Zealand is somewhat unique in our position in the Pacific. So lots of our Pacific neighbours are among the most vulnerable countries in the world when it comes to climate change. Some of them literally could cease to exist as a result of sea level rise. And so it's really important that New Zealand thinks about our responsibility to our neighbours, that we assist them, we take our responsibility to reduce our emissions seriously, and also potentially to take in climate refugees from those countries. And so these are really important things for New Zealand as a nation. And so just looking at it purely a more economic standpoint, New Zealand is unique amongst developed countries in that we are quite reliant on agriculture. And that means we have a very different emissions profile to most of the rest of the developed world. Namely, we have a lot of methane emissions, I'm sure you all know, as opposed to CO2. And agriculture is a really difficult, agriculture and emissions are a really politically difficult topic in New Zealand. We don't want farmers driving their tractors up the government steps talking about fart taxes. But thankfully methane only stays in the atmosphere for a short period of time compared to CO2, which can stay in the atmosphere for hundreds of years. So within the Zero Carbon Act, we have adopted what we call a two buckets approach. So we want to get our emissions of long-term greenhouse gases like CO2 down to zero by 2050. But shorter-lived greenhouse gases like methane, we're not aiming to get to zero at that point, but to just reduce them down to a sustainable level. So that kind of allows us to implement this without having quite as much of an impact on the economy and without angering the farmers too much. And also New Zealand in the past has relied a lot on international carbon credits to meet our obligations, particularly dodgy ones from the Ukraine that may or may not actually represent any decrease in emissions. So under the Zero Carbon Act, that would be forbidden. This would focus purely on New Zealand's domestic emissions and on decreasing those, not kind of outsourcing the process to other countries. And another really important issue that we want to consider in the Zero Carbon Act reflects the fact that a lot of the discussion around climate change really ignores the kind of vulnerable people that will be most affected by it. And so we want to reach out to those people, we want to ensure that they have input, and also ensure that going forward and addressing the issue of climate change, that those people aren't forgotten, that our solutions to climate change don't just make the problem worse for them. And so in the UK, the way they got this Climate Change Act passed was basically by a huge public campaign. So hundreds of thousands of people engaged in some sort of action, tens of thousands of people wrote to their local MP. They had all sorts of famous personalities involved and really reached out to parties across the aisle, across the political spectrum to get that support. And they were successful in doing that. So the MPs voted practically unanimously to support the Climate Change Act, and we're hoping for something like that to happen in New Zealand because, as I said at the start, this is far too big an issue for any one party to deal with. We need broad political consensus, we need everyone to agree so that we're not constantly flip-flopping every time there's an election. And we've actually had some success in that, so Young National, Young Labour and the Young Greens have all come out in support of the Zero Carbon Act, which is awesome, having the support of the youth wing of our three major parties. Hopefully we'll have other parties coming out and the main parties themselves rather than the youth wing in the future. And yeah, so we're getting started. We're going to do this. And we'd really like you to come on board. We'd really like you to help. There's a few ways you can do that. You can sign up to volunteer, to try and sign our petition, try and get more people to sign our petition. You can donate. You can host one of these presentations yourself. And also you can just connect us with your network. So if you know people that might be interested in this, or especially if you know people that are outside of our normal bubble of kind of educated urbanites that we normally get to talk to, you know people that aren't necessarily involved in environmental discussions, but you think would be really helpful with the Zero Carbon Act, or would really like to hear about this, then it would be awesome if you could connect us with those kinds of people. And of course, coming to our next event. So yeah, that's the super brief rundown of the Zero Carbon Act. If you want to know more, you can go to our website where we have everything broken down in detail and explained. And now I think we're having our intermission. Do you want to talk, Rosalie?
Well, thanks so much, Chris. How's everyone doing? Good. Oh, and yes, let's get a lot of you standing up the back, so thank you for that. Maybe after the break we could do a bit of a switch around so that those who have been standing can take a seat, but I'll let you sort that amongst yourselves. So we are just going to have a quick intermission. It's your chance to come and grab a drink. There's tea and coffee, alcoholic beverages, and some yummy juices as well. We're going to move into a bit of a Q&A session now, but first I'm just going to introduce, well, you've already heard from Lan, so I'll just introduce the other three panellists, and they're going to give about a 5-minute spiel on why climate change is an important issue for them, and perhaps speak to the Zero Carbon Act if they want to as well. So we've got Professor Stephen Ratuva, who is the Director of the Macmillan Brown Centre for Civic Studies at the university. Thank you so much, Steve, for being here. We know you're a very busy man. We've got Adelia Hallett. She is Forest and Birds climate advocate here from Wellington, so we really appreciate you being here as well, Adelia. And on the end there is Pubudu Senanayake, who's part of our Zero Carbon Act team, and also considered my fiance. So there you go.
Oh. Lucky me.
Cool. So I'm just going to pass the mic to Steve first, and we'll just give everyone about 5 minutes or so to kind of give a wee spiel about climate, and if you feel like speaking about the Zero Carbon Act, you can as well, but up to you, and then we'll have questions from the floor.
Well, thank you so much, Rosalie. I only have 5 minutes to solve the problems of the world. And just a couple of things I want to talk about in the 5 minutes. First of all is the fact that I think it's important to keep in mind that the climate change issue is not, over the years, been seen as being just environmental. In fact, it's linked to virtually every aspect of life. For a lot of small island communities in the Pacific, for instance, it's to do with survival, it's to do with their well-being. It's linked to, most societies in the world is linked to the water supply, the economy, the development, politics, social life, culture, and a whole lot of things. And secondly, there used to be the myth that some of the big forces that we are faced with every day are inevitable consequences of the way in which the world has been moving. Remember, in the early days, in our undergraduate days, the economists were telling us that the reason why the economy is behaving in a particular way is because of the invisible hand of the market. Well, in fact, the reality is that those hands are very visible. They're human beings with interests who have long claws, who grab money, they invest. Same thing with climate change. It was assumed that climate change is something which is a natural consequences of the way in which the world has been moving, when in fact they're individuals, they're groups, big corporations with interests who, in order to sustain the interests, climate change is one of the consequences of those. So that's why it's important to look at things in terms of its totality rather than just focus on one issue. The politics, of course, when Trump came in, when he denied climate change, it's supposed to be a Chinese hoax. He was speaking on behalf, not just of himself, but a whole lot of people behind the scene, the big corporations, and of course the energy companies, who over the years have fabricated the science. He was quoting from some of the reports from Montgomery and so forth, which were known to have been fabricators of scientific data in the past. So there's a whole lot of this. So when you talk about power, one of the French sociologists by the name of, not Pubudu, but Foucault would talk about the fact that power is everywhere. It's with the consumers, it's in your hands. Even the poorest, the most seemingly powerless person in the world has power. Depends very much on how you mobilize it. Not so much, not only in the hands of the big corporations, the big political institutions. One of the reasons why people like you, and of course not Option Zero, that was that was to do with the nuclear weapons. The zero generation is very important in terms of mobilizing people like us and putting together the focusing that energy, the synergy to be able to transform the big institutions. Now the last point, I suppose, has to do with, I think earlier on somebody talked about the power imbalance in terms of some of the most vulnerable groups in society. So not everybody is impacted the same way in terms of climate change. If you live in a big city, it will probably take an up the hill, probably take a bit of time. Some of the small island states in the Pacific, like Kiribati and Tuvalu, they experience it every day. Kiribati has bought 6,000 acres of land in Fiji, hoping that they will shift there one day. So the option is no longer trying to stop climate change, but to relocate. In those cases, they not only relocate as groups, but states relocating. So what you're going to see is the reconfiguration of the geopolitics of the world in terms of whole states relocating. When Kiribati moves to Fiji, is a state within a state that causes another level of complexity. And of course, New Zealand and Australia, which are the biggest countries in the Pacific, seem to have not so much the big hearts, but very small ones in terms of how they deal with what has been mentioned earlier as the migrants. In fact, the term climate change refugees has been criticized as for all kinds of reasons. So one of the terms used nowadays is migrants. So some of the small island states in the Pacific actually have opened their doors to some of the other migrants from the Pacific to come in, but certainly not to big countries like Australia and Fiji. Sorry, Australia and New Zealand. Australia is one of the biggest countries in this part of the world, but of course its immigration policy is not very friendly. When little kids and mothers come in a little boat, they chase them away to Nauru, or Manus Island in Papua New Guinea. So it's not so much the size of the country, it's the size of the heart of the country, which is going to be what counts at the end of the day in terms of responding to climate change. So with those words, and the last point, sorry, I have two last points. That was the first last point. The second last point is, I like the term zero because it has the kind of a psychological effect of the ultimate. I remember when I was in the Soviet Union in 1985, when Gorbachev came into power, one of the first things he mentioned was, let's have the option zero, get rid of all the nuclear weapons in the world. Now, it never transpired. And now, of course, the zero generation and the Zero Carbon Act. So it's a magical term, which I think we can use as a weapon to try, as a shield as well, as a means by which we can transform people's thinking in a zero way. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Am I on this mic or this mic? Who's in charge? It's all working? Okay. I don't know if you can see these guys on my lapel here. There's a kiwi, we all know about them. There's a yellow-eyed penguin. There's what I usually say is a Maui's dolphin, but since I'm in this neck of the woods, I'll say it's a Hector's. And there's a tuatara. And I had the unbelievable pleasure last Friday of holding one of these guys. It was pretty amazing. They actually make your hands cold, which is not something I'd realised. But these guys are really why I'm here. No doubt you're aware that a lot of New Zealand's, we've lost a lot of species since humans came here. People are less aware that a lot of our species are under serious threat now. Up to 3,000 of them are threatened. The Forest and Bird, we have two sayings. One is giving nature a voice, that's our job, and the other is nature's in crisis. So there's already a really big problem. Throw climate change into the mix, and the future for these guys becomes much, much worse. Where I live, although I am based, where have you gone? I am based in the Wellington office, but I live in Northland in Whangarei, out at Whangarei Heads, and we have kiwi. We can hear them calling at night. During the drought we had up there, this year, we're getting drought after drought after drought each summer. We had kiwi out during the daytime, and they're doing that because they are dehydrated, because they get their moisture from eating insects. And when the ground is baked hard, they cannot get those beaks down into the ground. So, you know, we had emaciated, dehydrated kiwi. That's what climate change means for kiwi. For the penguins, well, they live on the shore, you know, and they eat from the ocean. When the ocean changes, it's getting warmer and it's acidifying. We're already seeing increased levels of acidification in the Firth of Thames. The fish species can move, but the penguins and the other shorebirds that live on them can't. So, you know, you can see the problem there for them. The dolphins, well, the same problem happens with marine mammals as the oceans produce fewer phytoplankton. The biggest animals in the world, and right up to the big whales, they rely on some of the smallest creatures in the world, and those cycles are going to be badly affected by climate change. And then there's the tuatara, which is why I went to the zoo to have a look at them. And apparently Boris Johnson held one on Monday too. I'm not sure how I feel about that. He called it a lizard, and he also called a hongi a headbutt. So, yeah. Anyway, back to tuatara and climate change. Well, you know, you're probably aware that they are nothing, that they're related to reptiles. They are reptiles, but they are only related to lizards. They are from a completely separate order. They are, you know, the last of the dinosaurs, basically. They've been around for a couple of, 200 million years, but like crocodiles, for example, their sex is determined by the temperature when the eggs are in the nest. So you warm the planet a couple of degrees, and suddenly they're all boys. And I'm sure that you can think of a whole lot of reasons why that's really bad, and one of them is population and breeding. So, you know, we need to think about not only what climate change means for us as humans. This year we have seen some terrible destruction of our own homes. Before the floods of last weekend that affected you here and people in Otago, the insurance industry has this year spent $174 million on payouts for climate-related incidents. That's 5 floods and a fire, the Port Hills fire. Now that's $174 million without counting the cost of public infrastructure. So that, you know, that's our homes affected, but the habitat of our wildlife is going to be, the very future of our wildlife is seriously at threat. I won't go through all I could talk about this stuff for hours, but I won't go, you know, Generation Zero has talked to you really well about what's happening with our emissions. I can, you know, if you want me to, I can go into that later. But it's a very, very critical situation. The good news in terms of wildlife is that by protecting wildlife, we can help protect ourselves. If we've got really healthy ecosystems, it will buffer us against the impacts of the floods, for example, which you know probably feels very close to you at the moment. If you've got a really thriving forest, the rain coming down is slowed, it doesn't wash everything away, it just drips down into the soil, it filters out. That also protects us against drought because it just moves slowly through the ground. You have good dune systems that will protect us against the impacts of rising sea level and against the impact of storms thrashing against our homes. So there's lots of other examples I could give you, but they did say 5 minutes. So the 2 things I'd really like you to think about, if you could, is that nature is in crisis. Climate change makes it worse. Oh, this is 3 things. That by protecting nature, we can help protect ourselves. And the Zero Carbon Act is a really, really important way of doing that, of achieving what we need to do, which is to cut emissions fast and hard. We need to pull every lever we've got. We need to all contribute. You know, 3 practical things you can do. One is to plant some trees, preferably natives. That will help give wildlife somewhere to move as they need to move from the place they're in to somewhere a little bit more comfortable for them as the climate changes. So having those, you know, urban corridors, you know, corridors of trees through cities will really help. The second thing you could do is talk about it. It's, you know, we've seen what's happened in the United States and Australia and here to a certain extent. It's when we hear people like us, people that we trust, talking about it, that we open our minds and start to think about it. Oh, well, if, you know, he or she thinks this is real, maybe I need to actually open my mind to it. The third thing is sign the Zero Carbon Act and get your friends to do it.
Tēnā koutou, ko te tiriti o Waitangi te waka, ko Pubudu Senanayake. Before I start my reasons for why I think climate change is important, I just want to acknowledge that the vessel by which I am in New Zealand is the tiriti o Waitangi, as are most of you, I suspect. So I think we need to acknowledge where we are and what's brought us here. So the question of why am I interested in climate change? I was born in Sri Lanka. It's an island nation and we're poor. The colonial powers came in and extracted most of our wealth, and then through immigration policy shut us out from participating in the extracted wealth. It has happened here, it has happened in the Pacific, it has happened all over the world. And as they did this, they also started emitting carbon dioxide through industrialization. And now we look around and we say, you know, the population is growing too much, it's all problematic, India is burning lots of coal, what's China up to? Well, the thing is, you know, if I was an Indian government or if I was a Chinese government, I'd say, yeah, I'm going to keep on burning some coal because I need to make my people resilient so that the effects of what has happened so far don't kill my people. The reality is that the people, the 22 million people who are my family, who are my whānau, will die or be severely impacted through not much that they've done. If I don't fight for them until I am out of breath, if I don't fight for them until I can't stand anymore, then there is nothing for me to live for. And that sounds really sobering, and I understand that it's a bit intense, but ultimately it's a responsibility for us, you know, where we can gather in a place like this on a night like this. We don't have to worry about, you know, providing for everybody so that we can't actually do anything else. We are privileged, and it is up to us to do something about the problem. Now, New Zealand is an interesting example, and you know, you look back through the governments and the failures that they have had. Government and parliamentarians are supposed to be our leaders, but they have, for the last 2 decades, failed entirely and completely in their duties and in their responsibilities. That is not good enough. And the reason that they failed is because they're interested in 3-year cycles. They're interested in getting re-elected, they're not interested in leading. So we thought, okay, what we need to do is we need to take it out of their hands. If you're not going to be leaders, we'll sort it out for you. We'll give you the legislation, all you need to do is pass it, stop worrying about getting re-elected, and do something, do the duty that people are electing you to do. So that is one of the reasons why the Zero Carbon Act is so attractive to me, because basically we're removing the power from the parliamentarians. The parliamentarians, you know, I think they should forfeit their power when they fail to act, when they can't show leadership on the most pressing issue, as we've heard time and time again, that is facing humanity. If you can't act on that, why are you a leader? You are not a leader. You need to get out of parliament. So, if you are not going to act, then we will do it for you, and that's what this is all about. Now, my background is in science, so I'm going to punctuate this round with some science. And I want to just make this point. So we talk about this 2 degrees warming, we talk about these 1.5 degrees warming scenarios, and we come up with these carbon budgets. And what a lot of people don't realize is that the carbon budgets that we've come up with are a budget that is there such that we have a 2 in 3 chance of meeting the 2 degrees, right? So basically what they're saying is, let's go up with this budget, there's a 2 in 3 degrees chance of failing. So if I said to you, there's a 1 in 3 chance of your plane crashing, but the ticket's going to be real cheap. Right? I suspect most people wouldn't get on that plane. Yet when it comes to the fate of the planet, we are like, yeah, you know, it's okay, we can deal with that. I mean, what's the 33% chance of extinction level events happening? No biggie, right? It's all good. So it's insane. It's complete and utter insanity. And it's not because people are evil. It's not because, you know, people are sitting in a room going, yeah, this is going to be great when like, all of humanity is underwater or whatever. Not that we will be, but, you know, anyway. But it's because people can't prioritize, and it's because people, it's a very difficult and kind of broad problem. But that's where people like us, people who have engaged with this problem, can go and talk to people, communicate why it is so important, and just take a personal story and say, this is why I'm interested in this act, or in acting against climate change. Because climate change, it is true what Steve said, it's not actually an environmental problem, it is a symptom of a much deeper rot. But the problem is, if we don't deal with climate change, it's going to kill us, so the rot won't matter anyway. So the only way to get to fixing that rot is to deal with climate change first. And that's why I'm here. And that's why, when I'm not doing my day job, I try to do as much as I can on Zero Carbon Act. And yeah, so that's kind of it. But actually, just so if you want to talk, open up for questions and stuff, if you want to ask us anything about the Zero Carbon Act or the campaign or anything, that's what we're here for. And let's have an engaging conversation and try and get some opinions and ideas flowing.
Thank you, all three of you. So I was just going to get awkward as my just grab it. There we go. Alright, so we would like to hear from you if you have any questions about anything you've heard tonight, from Lan's talk, from any of the three panellists, from our Zero Carbon Act presentation. Now's your chance to ask us a question, and you can either direct it at someone or just throw it out there. Unfortunately, we don't have a roaming mic, so if you could speak up and I will repeat your question for the purposes of our recording, that would be awesome. So, who would like to ask one? Yep, down the back.
There you go. A lot of things I want to say. I'm a very pissed off individual, I can tell you. And it comes from 40 years of working in conservation. It seems to me that the only way, it's all about accountability. I mean, we can have an act. We've had the Paris Peace Talks. Prior to that, we've had numerous peace talks. We've been talking about, I've been going to climate change lectures for 25 years. We now know that what we were talking about then was incredibly conservative, although they were regarded as heretics back then. If we don't have some form of accountability, isn't everything such as the climate, Paris Peace Talks, irrelevant? Isn't the act irrelevant unless there's a form of accountability where it's either got to be monetary accountability, where, for instance, if you and I sign an agreement with a bank, if we don't adhere to that agreement, we're going to come unstuck. And I'm fed up with hearing politicians, adhering to something and then winning their way out of it over the years. So we need an act where there's financial accountability or legal accountability, whereas if you promise and if you sign that document, you will either face, I don't know, imprisonment, fine. Well, it's not, I mean, I'm hearing from this gentleman in the Pacific. 25 years ago, I spoke to an elderly gentleman from Pubudu. 25 years ago, their seawalls have been breached, so we're not doing anything. We have to, I mean, that might sound extreme, the imprisonment. I don't think it is. I think if these guys are going to represent us, and we put them in to represent us, they need to do their job. If I don't do my bloody job, I get sacked. But these guys get away with this. And, honestly, I'm fed up with it. So what do you think to the idea of some form of genuine accountability?
Cool. Thank you.
I'll take the first. Do you get it? That's a really good question, and I mean that's kind of what I was talking about before. Did everyone hear the question? Basically, the question is: if we don't have accountability, why do anything? Essentially. So there's a couple of things here. The Zero Carbon Act. Well, the thing is, no law in New Zealand actually makes Parliament accountable to anything, because technically, if you have the majority in Parliament, you can't change the law. We saw that just a couple of weeks ago with the Supreme Court passing making a decision on a certain thing, and then the government said, maybe we'll just change the law and then it'll be all good.
Ratuva Dam, we're quite involved in that.
That's right, yeah. But the thing is, if you try to do things like that, there will be some political fallout. So the idea behind an act like this is, within the legal framework that exists in New Zealand, the government will be accountable. That's the whole point. So the government will have to come up with a budget. They will have to stick to that. If they don't, either the people can take them to court, or NGOs like Forest and Bird or whoever wants to can take them to court, and then the court can decide. And then there will be an actual act and a set of principles by which the court must decide whether the government has failed. At the moment, there isn't. So there's a couple of interesting cases in court right now, which is, what's the name of it? Sarah Thompson, that's right. Sarah Thompson has taken the government to court saying that they're not doing enough, essentially. But there's another interesting one, which was a couple of weeks before that, where some people took the government to court saying that they're failing in their treaty obligations by not acting on climate change, which is actually a lot, probably has a much bigger chance of succeeding. So what comes out of that will be interesting to see what the legal framework around that will be. And the other thing to note is that in the United Kingdom, where there's a similar act, it has worked. The governments so far have not failed to meet the budgets that they set out, and that the Climate Commission has assessed to be of robust quality. So if they fail, then that will be an interesting test as well. But at the moment, it looks like countries where this model has been adopted, governments have felt like they are being held to account, so they have acted. So that's why we've gone with this model, and we think it can be successful here as well.
Something to watch for tomorrow is that the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, Dr. Jan Wright, will be releasing her analysis of the UK system and her views on whether it will work for New Zealand. And so, if you want to get more information about how it's worked in the UK, that's something that will be released at 2:30 tomorrow afternoon, and it should be on the PCE's website.
Sorry. Sorry. Yeah. It's a very good question. I mean, there are different kinds of accountability. One is legal accountability, and one is political as well, particularly in the liberal democracies. Like in Europe, it's a number of countries like Scandinavian countries have put the target, and they have been able to some extent achieve what they have, put together, almost like a political consensus for that, to do that. So a lot of companies are now beginning to move in the direction of clean energy, and not so much as a result of their conscience telling them you have to be a good human being, but because that's where the money is nowadays. They're looking for where they can make profit, and of course clean energy now, sustainable energy, is a big business, it's a big deal at the moment. That's where a lot of them are moving in that direction. So yes, it's important to build in legal accountability in terms of how liable you are legally. At the same time, there has to be very strong, well, not only legal, moral and political processes in place. After all, we are all human beings. At some point, when there's a lot of pressure, as a result of a lot of global pressure, a lot of the companies are beginning to shift. A lot of the countries as well in Europe, not so much in New Zealand, have begun to shift in their kind of thinking about climate change. So there's a lot of hope in terms of, although we're all frustrated about what happens, but there's always hope somewhere, after all, that what sustains humanity.
Can I just say really quickly? Yeah, great question. Agree with everything that's been said, but just wanted to add as well, I totally believe in accountability for politicians in particular, and I don't think you're being overly dramatic. This is dramatic times, and I think what, fortunately or unfortunately, is probably one thing that is pushing governments, and even at a local government level we're talking about it, is around liability. And if we actually fail to act, considering the weight of scientific consensus that we have at our fingertips, what does that look like in terms of liability for government, for politicians? So that's a good push, and a sort of sad push that it took that kind of weight to move things along.
Hello. Just wondering whether the Act has got some sort of provision or framework set up for a carbon tax, if that's something that's included or not, or that you looked at.
That's a good, interesting question actually. So one of the key things about the Zero Carbon Act is that it doesn't prescribe any particular policy mechanisms. So what it does is it sets out kind of three things. One is that hopefully we can set this target of net zero carbon or net zero long-lived gases by 2050, and the Climate Commission. But the other thing is binding targets to meet those overall targets and binding carbon budgets. That's all it says. How the government of the day chooses to meet those carbon budgets is completely up to them, whether it's a carbon tax, whether it's making a local form of an ETS. Obviously there are principles that forbid the government from buying credits from international ventures for domestic reductions. So, you can still buy international credits for your international commitments, but for your domestic commitments, you have to have domestic reductions. How you do it is completely up to the government of the day, and that's kind of the flexibility in the UK Act that's allowed it to survive through successive governments, because when governments have felt, oh, I don't really like that set of policies, they can change it and tweak it a bit. The problem is if we push for a carbon tax or whatever, it's much harder for a government to come on board with it because you take a lot of power away from them. But if the carbon budgets are being met, and we have principles of equity that Chris talked about in there, where the government has to consider the impact on all people of New Zealand when they come up with their policies, then I think that will balance that out.
Yeah, this is a question for the whole panel, but I'm particularly interested in things that we can do ourselves to help. I was looking in the back of this Forest and Bird brochure, I suppose, and it had some good suggestions. But one thing that I didn't see mentioned there was the effect of diet, and I had heard that vegetarian and vegan diets were quite a good thing to do. I was just keen to get you guys' comment on that. And
Yeah, there is. I mean, our land use, that's primarily what we're talking about here, is a huge part of it. In New Zealand, biological emissions, basically from farming, are responsible for nearly half our emissions, which is, a problem the government at this stage isn't even willing to put on the table to discuss. It was excluded from the ETS review. I saw some figures the other day that only 1% of the biomass, that's the animals in the world, is wildlife now. The rest is either us or our farm animals. So yes, it will make a huge difference. I've actually been experimenting with veganism myself this week. It's quite interesting. but it's really hard when you're not at home, I've discovered. So yes, look, you don't have to become a vegan. You can move along that trajectory. But yes, it's two kind of key points. Every action you take, whether it's changing your light bulbs, not flying, planting trees, whatever, every single thing matters and will help, and that includes changing your diet. But shifting the problem onto the actions of individuals is such a cop-out. It's about our leadership and it's about the system. It's systemic. We actually have to change our big systems. It's very hard not to drive your car if you have to go to work and there's absolutely no other way to get there. So there's lots of things that you can and should and must do if you can. But the really big thing is to get the word across to our leaders, and that's our political leaders and our economic leaders, our business leaders, is that this is what we expect. This is the new normal. The low carbon economy is coming in really hard and fast around the world. You've got people like Michael Bloomberg, the former mayor of New York, who also Bloomberg Economics. You've got Mark Carney, who's the governor of the Bank of England. He's now saying things like exposure to fossil fuel investments could cripple the world's economy. That so if your superannuation fund is invested in, I don't know, new coal mines on the Buller Plateau, for example, our government's looking at 13 new coal mines there and rushing it through special legislation to allow it to happen, or subsidising oil exploration off where I live and all around the show. If your superannuation fund is invested in there, you forget about all the environmental issues for a minute and just think about whether, when the rest of the world is not buying this stuff, because that's what's happening. China has really reduced its coal consumption, and India, lots of economies are doing that. is that where you want your money? So there's some really hard and fast things you can do there. You can say to your super fund, for example, so it's getting that big message across, telling people that this is what you expect, the world has changed.
If I can just add to that, absolutely agree that changing a diet and stuff is great, but I think the single most important thing you can do in New Zealand, especially, is engage politically, right? We have unprecedented access to our politicians. I'm sitting next to one right here. Not that Lan is a typical politician, but but the point is that
nice politician.
it's a very effective one. I can talk to my councillors, I can probably talk to my MPs and my parliamentarians, right? And the other thing to realize is that New Zealand also actually plays a pretty significant role in international negotiations, and we are well respected there. So given our access to our politicians, the individual per capita political influence we have in the world is actually much, much greater than, say, for a United States citizen or a British citizen. So what we need to do is exercise our political capital and write to our MPs and say, look, it doesn't have to be the Zero Carbon Act, but hopefully it is. But pass this legislation, act on this legislation, make policies to deal with the problem. And if enough people, politicians want to stay in power, so if there's enough political pressure, they will do the things that they are being asked to do. And we can create that pressure, and that is the single most effective thing a single individual can do, I think. As well as all the great things that people are doing.
Sorry, no, okay.
Just to really emphasise that point, and particularly with local government, like regional councils or Environment Canterbury at the moment, we're talking about our long-term plan, which is what guides regional council. It's a 10-year plan, and in it we set priorities, and that's really how we spend our money. So the conversation at the moment is around climate action, and you'd think, as the managers of our resources across Canterbury, climate change would play a significant role in where we prioritise our money and our efforts. What I'm trying to encourage people to do is to tune up to our monthly meetings, and unfortunately they are during the day when people are working, which is really inconvenient. Our next one is August 24th, but at our last meeting we had Bronwyn Hayward from the University of Canterbury, who's on the International Panel for Climate Change, speak about urging ECAN to really take a lead on climate issues. That had a really big impact on council because it also filled our public gallery, which really has an impact on our councillors. And I'm hoping that we can actually do that every month. Every month they see a wall of faces demanding action and asking what we're doing continuously, and I think that's really how we're going to do it. So if you find me on Facebook, Lan, Pham, ECAN Councillor, I'll be updating and really calling for people to tune up to those kind of things, which does have an impact.
Yeah, I think sometimes we tend to undermine and undervalue the individual contribution of people. I mean, like I said earlier, it's a multi-dimensional problem, and therefore it has to be tackled at different levels. At the global level, UN level, have the COP21, 25, which is coming. And at the regional level, within the Pacific, you have a climate change kind of framework. And then national, and of course, individuals and at the local level. I remember when I was a student in Britain in the mid-90s, there was when the green product movement became very strong. It came from the people. And so for companies who wanted their products to be sold, they had to have a stamp of green. So it was the consumers who had the power to be able to drive companies to move in a particular direction. Same thing with fair trade, and the same thing with the peace movement. I was in the peace movement in the 1970s and 80s, where so much of the people power, individuals like you and me, which actually drove some of the nuclear-free the nuclear-free Pacific agreement, the Ratuva Treaty, after New Zealand. After David Lange created New Zealand nuclear-free and so forth. So those were as a result of the power of individuals and peoples and groups. Remember that politicians too, they thrive on people's sentiments. They look around, what are they saying? For my vote, I want to be elected. So if there's silence and just rely on them to do the move, then of course nothing might happen. So it has to be multidimensional at different levels so that the process can be at the top, global level. Of course, it has to be two strategies. One is proactive, the second one is reactive. When Trump comes along, the individual and says, hang on, then you have to react to that as well. So in terms of the global level, that's one of the reasons why the global level may not be easy to put legal mechanisms in terms of punishing countries because of the fact that legal sovereignty is within countries. But you have the World Trade Organization, which is an example. What they do is that they can, if you like, in fact, punish countries who flout their rules of trade. So we can do the same thing. There's some examples globally where you can use examples already in existence, which we can use in the context of climate change.
Hi. A couple of years ago, I think it was, that Megan Woods made a comment that really struck home with me, and that was that when she can go into the average working men's club and talk honestly and openly about climate change, she will know that we're getting somewhere. So my point is, I suppose, there's a huge rump of ignorant, willfully ignorant people in New Zealand, and until we can move that massive rump of ignorance to pressure politicians to do something, we're going to be fighting an uphill battle. So my question is, do you guys have some suggestions about breaking through into the working men's club bubble and getting these people to start taking it seriously?
I'll start, I guess. Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think it's about having honest conversations ultimately. Yes, there is ignorance, but and maybe it's willful, but I think look, life is hard, right? I mean, like I said, for us, sitting here is great. We can sit here on a Wednesday night and yarn about climate change and whatever. Most people don't have that luxury, you know? And so it's not that they're, you know, it's not that they want the world to suffer, it's just that, yeah, life is hard. And if someone comes to you and says, oh, you're not doing enough, or why aren't you more educated, or whatever, I'm not going to listen. I'm going to say, well, get stuffed. You know, so to me, personally, it's about understanding why life is hard for those people and having a genuine conversation about that, and then highlighting that actually around the corner we have this other problem coming, which is going to make life even harder. And we're more common than we're different, so let's actually try and work together on this. And I think it's worked in the past. I mean, if you take things like the anti-war movement against the Vietnam War, at first it was perceived as a bunch of hippies kind of didn't really care about it, whatever. What really broke through was the images of what was happening in Vietnam that are flowing through to the households of the Americans, and they realized that this was a lot bigger than just a bunch of hippies fighting against a war because they were, you know, pacifists or whatever. So I think those kinds of moments are important. It's important to realize that people are, if they are ignorant, they're not ignorant. Well, some might be, but most people aren't ignorant because they're terrible people. It's just life is hard, and the economic system makes life hard, everything. And that's why we're running a public campaign. That's why we want to, you know, that's why we want to get people behind us, and that's why we want every single one of you to go and have a conversation with someone you wouldn't have a conversation with about climate change, right? Be it at your work, be it at, you know, at the bus station, wherever. Someone you wouldn't talk to about this kind of stuff. Talk to them. Understand where they're coming from, where they're sitting, and why they can't engage with this. Have a genuine conversation, or 2 or 3 or whatever. That's the first step, and that's the only step we can really take right now, I think.
Yeah, that's why I said in my 3 points of things you can do is talk about it. You know, it needs to be from people we trust. Actually, my oldest friend, you know, since I was a little kid, is in the room because I'm staying with her, and it was her mother who was a scientist back in the 1980s who made me understand climate change, but at a basic level accept it, because she was someone I trusted and she knew something. She was a scientist, she understood it, and her simple answer to my question was, well, I think there's enough evidence that if we wait until we've got proof, it's too late. And I've never forgotten that. You know, I've remembered that for 30 or 40 years, or however many years it's been. There was a really, really interesting story in the New York Times this week. A science teacher in a high school had gone to sort of Trump country to teach, and he was given a class of really, really bright 17-year-olds who, you know, really smart kids. Their fathers were all laid off miners, so, you know, and they voted Trump. And so he started talking to them about climate change, and they were so sceptical. He didn't get through to all of them. Some actually left his class. But the ones he did get through to, he got through by taking them out into the world. They went into the, what we'd call it the bush, they call it the woods, and he got them to do tests on their local river. It was the same acidity as white vinegar, and parts of it were orange. This was all from the mine tailings. And they interviewed this young woman, this 17-year-old student, and she said, well, I started to realise that if the mine could affect the river, what else could it affect? So she got there through something she understood. So, you know, your question about the Working Men's Club, if we can get, you know, one member of the Working Men's Club alongside, and then have him, I'm assuming it's a him since they're working men. I used to work for a trade union, so I do know a little bit about, and actually I can tell you the Council of Trade Unions is moving on this stuff. But, you know, it's really important, those conversations we have. It's the normalising of it. Don't be afraid. I mean, you know, sometimes we feel uncomfortable. So, you know, sometimes I even think, should I tell this person what I do? My boss didn't hear that, did you? But, you know, normalise it.
Yeah, I wish I had a really good answer to that question, because I'm really interested in moving that rump and getting through to those people. And I think even just to go back to the point that Pubudu made about the influence of local government, I think targeting the politicians, the leaders, particularly in our regional sectors, you know, at the local government conference I've just been at, it's hundreds of, you know, the mayor of Waimate or Opotiki, and, you know, it's people that, well, from my perception, aren't thinking about climate change yet, but that was an opportunity that I had to talk to as many people as possible about, you know, really tapping into, like, what is the point of us as leaders if we're not protecting our communities, things like that. So, yeah, that's probably all. I wish I had a good answer.
Yeah, that's a very good question, because it's been a problem in the past. Still continues to be a problem, particularly now, when at the age of the fake news, almost everything that you say could be fake, according to Trump, and alternative facts and so forth. So you're fighting against these big ideological forces. How do you get through them? Let's not forget that people think differently, the different psychological spaces within which people think. If you're well educated, if you have, if you've been, learning about and hearing about climate change and all those things, and of course at the high level. But for ordinary people, it's a matter of, for a lot of them, it's to do with the bread and butter issues every day. Unless you're able to link a particular issue to their own lives, then it's very difficult. From my experience as peace activist in the 1980s, the anti-nuclear movement, people were saying, what is all this crazy people talking about? Is there going to be a nuclear war or whatever? So you have to be very strategic in the way in which you connect people's individual lives and group lives with the issue, because of the way in which people have their priorities in life, and they think within the particular space, and they look at themselves in relation to the world depending on their interests. If you talk to a corporate manager, of course, his idea is money. He'll say, no. If it means that he's not going to make money, then that's it. One of the problems in the Pacific, research done in Kiribati and Tuvalu, is that the religious people are resistant. Well, a lot of villages use the Bible as a means of resistance against climate change, the idea of climate change, because the argument is that it's God's will anyway. Why should you undermine God's will? If we drown tomorrow, that's God's will. If you go against those guys, those activists are trying to do things against God's will. So you have all kinds of ideological forces and cultural forces within society, and you have to go. So it's not a simple matter of going into, was it the workman's club or whatever, tell a whole lot of beer drinking guys, hey look, but rather have to be strategic, understand the psychology within which they operate, and the culture, and their interests. And then you, over the years, the peace movement have been very strategic in those sense, in terms of identifying, if you like, the weak spots, as they call it, and then strategize in terms of propaganda. Well, terrible term. Information, sorry. And how do you change those? So it's complex. At the same time, it's doable in the context how strategic you are and how systematic you are in terms of addressing particular groups in particular circumstances.
I'll just add to that. I think someone made the point earlier, I can't remember who it was, but the trusted messenger is really important here. So it's not, there's no point in me as a white middle-class New Zealander going to communities that aren't going to relate to me and trying to have conversations with them about this kind of stuff. Like, I'm just not going to get through and they're not going to trust me. So it's about actually empowering the people that can be the trusted messengers to reach out to the people that need to be reached out to. Yeah, just wanted to add that. I'm aware that we've just gone 9 o'clock and it is a weeknight, so if you do need to head off, don't feel bad, that's totally okay. I think we'll just have one more question from the guy in the white shirt. Sorry to other people that have got questions, but please feel free to stick around and come and talk to us. We will be around for a little while. But can we have your question?
Thanks. I guess a two-part question is, do you think we're doing enough in education in New Zealand around this, in primary and secondary education? And I think the answer is no as well. And okay, how can we influence that from the people in this room and as Generation Zero to really get our young people passionate about this and to help shape the tree?
Oh, yeah. I don't think we're doing enough. We're never doing enough around education, but particularly around climate change. One thing that was really great to come out of the Local Government New Zealand conference is they released a sector-wide view, basically a set of 5 demands of central government, and one of them, the first one, was a public awareness campaign equal to that of drink driving safety belts around climate change. Because, and this is where sort of the liability comes in, it's like we're not even letting citizens know what they could likely expect from climate change, even in terms of adaptation, let alone what they could do to actually start reducing emissions. So that is critical, and we're certainly not doing enough around that.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think we're doing enough. I mean, I haven't been in the education system for a while now, so I'm not sure. Certainly when I was in school, we weren't taught anything about climate change. The question of how can we influence what the curriculum is, essentially. I think there are actually some groups who are doing a lot of good work, and Anglican Advocacy is one of them who've been trying to actually start little programs for NCA grade, basically, around civic issues. But last year, I think they did one particularly around how legislation works in relation to climate change. So there are groups like that who are starting that. And I think the other thing we can do is actually start talking to teachers about this, because teachers do have somewhat of a say in what units are getting taught in school. So personally, I have friends who are, who've been scientists who are not in the teaching profession, and they will, let's say, creatively interpret their unit standards to incorporate climate change into the science curriculum, for example. And I think that's a really key thing. I think we're in a situation where, we can get academics to try and push that through. That's one aspect. But I honestly feel like our leadership has constantly failed, and I mean at the central level. So because of that, I feel like, and it's kind of weird that we have to kind of subvert that by talking to individual educators, essentially. And that's right, for that kind of thing. I mean, I'm part of Generation Zero. I believe that we can have political change, but it has to come from the bottom as well as the top. And I think education is one of those things. I think we have, I mean, there are academics in universities who are very aware of this problem. So they do have an influence in where the curriculum goes. So hopefully it'll start changing as well. But so it's kind of a two-pronged approach from me.
Very quickly, very practical thing. Forest and Bird has a kids club, the KCC, Kiwi Conservation Club, and the December magazine is going to be all about climate change, and it's all will be presented in a way that's done by teachers, and we make those really widely available, and you know, kids join KCC and get all these things to do. So yeah, practical resource available.
So very quickly, there are basically two ways in which you can do that. One is through informal civic education. And a lot of Generation Zero in groups such as that would be pretty good in doing that in terms of conscientizing the young generation. And secondly, in fact, one of my, it's the curriculum itself, one of my PhD students is doing a research on how you can actually incorporate climate change into the curriculum. Not only the science curriculum, but social science as well. After all, climate change is multidisciplinary. Now, and you know, from a lowest level, perhaps towards highest level, primary school, secondary school. Now, but one of the problems with our with our education system, and of course our university, I work in university, so I have the freedom to talk about what happens within university. I work in a number of universities around the world, and that is the silos, the disciplinary silos where people are located becomes territorial. And issues like climate change is perceived as something, okay, that's for those guys over there in the laboratory, rather than something which can be interdisciplinary, can be dealt with in a very interdisciplinary manner. Some universities are moving that direction. So it's something which is expected to be taught in the classroom, but only in certain classes, rather than something which can be, like for instance, if there's a climate change course offered by geography, for instance, which is somewhere between science and social science, then other social scientists or scientists cannot take the course because the way in which the units are being prescribed is that you can't take anything extra. Unlike, say, the American universities, they have this kind of liberal arts where you can take anything from physics to philosophy in one degree. You can't do it here. So there is limitation in terms of the way in which the institutionalized silo thinking, disciplinary focus, narrow university-type academia, which we have, which doesn't allow that kind of, interdisciplinary discourse to flow between departments and disciplines in a dynamic way. So, so there are basically two things. One is how we can change, perhaps from within the education system, the formal structure and pedagogy, and secondly, through the informal civic education process. Of course, our leaders, because it has to come from down here, from up there, and they meet somewhere. Then they have a whirlpool of visionary engagement. Yeah.
I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you, Steve. So just to wrap up, I know we've probably cut the question time a bit short, so apologies for that, but it is getting quite late. But please feel free to come and talk to any of us about what you've heard tonight. We'd love to chat with you more. We'll be sticking around for a bit, so if you want to grab a drink and please finish off the food as well, that would be much appreciated. We don't want to take that home. I just want to say a few thank yous before everyone rushes off. Firstly to Space Academy for having us tonight, and these guys actually, we got here about, 5:30, expecting to spend, sort of 45 minutes setting up all the sound equipment, and we got here and they'd just already done it all this was set up for us, and we didn't even ask, so you guys rock, thank you. Secondly, to all our great speakers of tonight, Steve, Lan, Adelia, Pubudu and Chris, thank you all so much for your time. I'd also just like to say a special thank you to Forest and Bird, who actually sponsored this evening. If you want to find out more about what Forest and Bird are up to, please go and see Colleen, who's the regional branch coordinator. Do you want to give a little wave, Colleen? or Adelia while she's here. But yeah, thank you so much to Forest and Bird. They're one of our core allies for this campaign, and we are really grateful for their support.
Lots of magazines over there if you want to know more about it.
Yeah, grab a brochure from the table as well. Also Will and Davina for photographing and videoing. Thank you. And finally, just to all of you for showing up and being here and being part of this really important conversation. We really hope that you've enjoyed tonight, that you've got something to take away. And if you're keen to hear more about what we're up to and get involved, you can sign up on the website. I'll get that up in just a second. There's a volunteer tab that you can click and we'll get in touch. You can also sign up at the desk on your way out, and you can get a t-shirt, get a brochure or a badge, and just stay in touch with what we're getting up to. We've got some exciting things on the cards, including a cycle tour of the country at the end of the year. We're going to be delivering the Zero Carbon petition anywhere and everywhere on bikes, so that's going to be cool. Can't say too much about it because we haven't actually got it sorted yet, but that's what's coming up anyway, and it's going to be huge. And yeah, we're going to be focusing mainly on driving those petition numbers up and delivering this petition to Parliament with, you know, hundreds of thousands of New Zealanders behind it, ideally. You want to say?
And just quickly, we are also still open to feedback on the actual policy framework itself. So the website allows you to submit feedback on particular aspects of the whole thing if you wish. So we would really appreciate that as well, because it's actually in the consultation phase at the moment, and we are considering actually writing a bill and presenting a complete bill to Parliament as well. So that's a maybe, but yeah, so any feedback would be greatly appreciated. Thanks.
And especially, sorry, just one last thing, especially what we were saying before about connecting us with different communities, because we recognise that Generation Zero is quite a non-diverse group at the moment, and we want that to change, and it needs to change if we're serious about this act. So please, yeah, come and talk to us and help us break out of our bubble. But yeah, thank you so much for being here. You're all amazing, and have a great rest of your week.